Okay, I think we can begin our session. Just a few housekeeping things, everyone. I see everyone is having their headphones on. So please make sure that you can hear me right now clearly, as this is the microphone that I will be passing around to the speakers and this one as well. So everyone can hear our conversation very clearly. And I think your headphones should be on channel 2. So if everyone can give me a thumbs up if you can hear on your headphones. Okay, I see a lot of thumbs up. Thank you very much, everyone. I am personally very excited about this panel that we are having here at the amazing Hili Forum. I think we can agree that this setup that we have over here in Abu Dhabi, and I'm very proud to be a part of it, as I'm sure the rest of the panelists and everyone here is as well. So our panel is a very interesting one. The topic of our panel is US-China competition. It is about the competition between two of the world's superpowers. The US and China have one of the world's most complex, but also most important bilateral relationships in the world. Since 1949, the countries have experienced periods of tension, but also periods of cooperation in areas like trade, climate change, and Taiwan. But arguably in this era that we are living in now, technology is the highest contention point between the two powers. Billions of dollars are being spent on the technology sector by both countries to guarantee, let's say it out loud, strategic power and the upper hand in global security. So what does this mean for emerging tech powers around the world? Because after all, the world does not revolve only around China and the United States, even if the combined population of both countries is a whopping 1.7 billion people. Over the course of the next hour and 15 minutes, we will be discussing this contention point, but we will also be discussing the multidimensional contest between both countries. And this, of course, includes the economy, the military and security, and socio-cultural elements as well. And what does this mean for emerging tech powers around the world? Now, first, let me please introduce our wonderful experts and panelists here before we begin our intense conversation. We have Dr. Tingyi Wang, who is a research fellow at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy. We also have Dr. Yu Qi, who is a professor of sociology and the director of the Center on Contemporary China at Princeton University in the United States. Also joining us is Dr. Tianjiao Jiang, who is an associate professor at the Development Institute at Fudan University in China. And also joining us is Dr. Brendon J, who is the assistant professor of international security at Khalifa University here in the UAE. So there's a lot of topics that we're going to cover, but I would like to start with possibly my favorite part of this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, we are fast approaching the presidential election of the United States of America. We have Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, who have very different but very similar as well policies towards China and technology and the technology landscape around the world. I'm sure you've all seen the debate between the two presidential candidates over a week ago. Show of hands, who's seen the debate? Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, yes. A very interesting debate. China and billions of dollars have been said several times throughout this debate. But I think we can all agree that the rhetoric was very much built on division and fear when it came to China and trade, with Trump saying that China is owning America, quote unquote, and Harris accusing Trump of selling the country to China. Trump reiterated during the debate his commitment to imposing a 60% tariff, not just on high-tech Chinese products anymore, but also on tech Chinese products across the board. And apparently this 60% tariff would generate $300 billion in net revenue for the United States, according to experts. On the other hand, Kamala Harris said that she would support American leadership in AI, semiconductors, and a lot of other tech spaces. And she also addressed the unfair trade practices from China. And these are her words. Dr. Yu, I wanted to start with you. you said that one of the core issues in this relationship between the US and China is that there is a misconception between both countries. You said Americans think that China is a single entity, and the Chinese think that America is a single mind. What are the main issues that jump out at you when you hear this sort of rhetoric from presidential candidates? Do they simply not know enough about China, in your view, and the Chinese tech landscape?
It's kind of interesting. Americans have been fascinated about China for more than 200 years. Probably was the only Western country that invested heavily in China. Can you all hear me?
Can everyone hear? All right, I'll give the mic anyway.
So, for example, Tsinghua University was founded with American money. The best medical school was funded by Rockefeller Foundation. So Americans have been fascinated by China from very, very early days, including, for example, my former president, both Princeton University president and as well as U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. They knew ahead of time that China was going to be important. And today, China is important, probably the most important political issue for the U.S. But unfortunately, I think in my view, Americans have not understood China well. They have misunderstanding of China. For a while after the economic reform in China that began in 1978, Americans expected political reform that will go along the democratic political option for China. And that did not pan out. And Americans have been disappointed and in some ways surprised by the turn of the events in China. And in some ways, in my view, they probably had an unrealistic expectation to begin with. When their unrealistic expectation was not fulfilled, and they turned suddenly against China. So the attitudes among American elites as well as public have changed a lot over the last 2 decades. And right now, the attitude is pretty negative. So China has become, in some ways, a scapegoat for domestic issues facing the U.S. You have rising income inequality. You have a problem with health system, education system, urban centers in the U.S., and labor issues and deindustrialization. A lot of social issues face America right now. And one thing that does unify the two parties is China, and you need to deal with China strongly. And that is one theme that unifies different wings of the political spectrum in the US. I think this is unfortunate, in part because they have not really fully understood China, and they don't know what to deal with China. I think in some ways, I think this is a unfortunate outcome, and it is true that China is a big issue for the election.
Thank you, Dr. Yu, for your insights there. Dr. Brendon, I wanted to come to you with this question. And first of all, as an American and as an expert on these issues, do you agree with this rhetoric? Does it have to be this aggressive, divisive tone, given the current risks? And if your answer is yes, what are the current risks that sort of need this sort of rhetoric or tone to be said in this huge political platform in the U.S.?
Thank you. Look, I agree with my esteemed colleague here with much of what he said. I don't think Americans understand China very much at all, although it is very interesting to see that these two political parties who rarely agree on anything are somehow agreeing on China and its actions and behavior in the international system. Now, we've seen America act like this in the past. For some of you, very few of you perhaps, the ancient history of the 1980s and the Japanese economic miracle that at the time was very, very much worrisome to the American political class as well as the economic class. Now, this was a fellow democracy, et cetera, but the rhetoric at the time was quite alarmist. So is the rhetoric too alarmist now? Well, perhaps not. Japan never posed a serious security threat and never questioned the underpinnings of, say, the post-war international order that was really put together, cobbled together by the United States in particular, but also a number of other states after World War II. Underneath the concern about lack of democratization in China, which I think is a very small facet of American concern, there's really the very serious economic and security concerns. And so I think the rhetoric, while unhelpful in many respects, but this is an election year and things get pretty shrill, so it's a little more exaggerated than what it would be perhaps coming from the White House after the election. Nonetheless, the rhetoric, there is an element of truth in it because of the way China has changed, particularly over the past 10 years, really over the past 20 years. This isn't President Hu's China. This isn't President Jiang's China. This is President Xi's China. And there's been a very, very big difference in the way China acts, particularly in its near abroad, since 2013. And so that's kind of the antecedents of all of this, or the precedent that's setting this.
Yeah, and I'm happy you brought up this change in China, and you brought up a security topic as well. And this was going to be my follow-up question to you. What is the U.S. so afraid of when it comes to technology, security, and China?
Yeah, again, it's another question because technology is just a facet of the wider security and political concerns the United States has about China. Look, time in the international system of states, a state's power rises very quickly, and China's has done so drastically in the 1980s. It's going to cause a little disruption, a little uncertainty, et cetera, et cetera. But when that state also begins to question territorial maritime demarcations that have been around for a number of years, this becomes very problematic. And I want to point out that it's not just the United States that's concerned about China's moves in, say, in the Western Pacific, the South China Sea in particular, but also territorially in places like South Asia. It's not just the U.S. We've got multiple countries around Japan, South Korea, India, et cetera, that they've all seen their relations with China take a nosedive recently. And so something's going on here, and I think that needs to be faced squarely. And again, there's a push and pull here. This is not a one-way street. This is not China's fault. I'm not saying that. I think we need to have a nuanced and friendly argument about this. But nonetheless, there is some element in American concerns that are mirrored by all of China's neighbors. Well.
Okay. And Dr. Tianjiao, I want to come to you for the other side of the coin. Just as the U.S. may have fears, and according to Dr. Brendon, neighboring countries of China, does China have equal fear of the United States being a tech power as well? And are there security fears from China towards the United States, just as the other side has as well, in your view?
Yeah, thank you, Lina, for the question. Before answering the question, I would like to remind everyone that, in fact, today is Chinese traditional festival, the Mid-Autumn Festival.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
So the round moon represents a family reunion. So I think also thank you for Hili Forum bringing us together. I think I'm here for peace and dialogue. So I think this is very important. And go back to your question, I think, yes, China also has serious concerns about US tech power or tech hegemony, in fact. So Brandon may disagree with me, but let me illustrate the case of Edward Snowden. So in fact, Edward Snowden, since I think he disclosed the US global surveillance project, China realized that it must have its own independent and self-reliant technology. Before Edward Snowden, China also accepts all of the, US tech, US service, software, hardware, Cisco, Google, Apple, everything. It's good, efficient. So, but after Snowden, I think it's a big change. President Xi mentioned and emphasized for many times that there will be no national security without cybersecurity. And so I think that's why, since then, we don't want to be, watched by the United States. And in fact, it is, I think, a shock to the global, not just the cybersecurity, but also national security across the world. Not only to countries like China, but also like surveillance project on US partners and allies. So this is a big shock to the global, I think, security landscape. And since then, I think more and more countries, in fact, they are establishing cyber forces and also passing cybersecurity laws to defend their own national security. So I think this is also, anyway, a perspective that I observed for decades. And another case I would like to illustrate is about Huawei and 5G. So, since Edward Snowden, China believed that it has to have its own technology power. But when Huawei succeeded in 5G, all of this, telecommunication, a lot of patents, recent sales across the world, then Huawei faced, I think, what happened, in fact, to Japanese Toshiba and also to French Alstom companies decades ago. All of the export control sanctions, in the name of national security reasons. So I think if Huawei really has its backdoors or the so-called security problems, you can have the third party to do the lab, test evaluation. But you cannot say that just because Huawei is a Chinese company, then it must have the security problems. I think it is not a fair competition. Thank you.
We're definitely going to be talking about Huawei a little bit further down the line, but you said something very interesting that's a very good segue into my next point. China had to do it on its own. The US as well, I believe, has been cooperating with a lot of other countries, but essentially has done it on its own. It's a very divisive kind of way of thinking, but there's a lot of elements that have led us to this point. I think we can all agree. So let's talk about the polarization that we're seeing on the global landscape right now. According to Donald Trump and Elon Musk, there is what they call an evil axis. This evil axis is consistent of China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And you've got the other axis, which consists of the US, Japan, South Korea, and some European Union countries. It's a clear polarization and clear alliances that definitely shape the global tech landscape and definitely affect emerging tech powers. Dr. Tingyi, I wanted to come to you when speaking about this polarization, global polarization. What are the risks, in your view, of having such a polarized global setting? And are there any advantages to it to emerging tech powers? Yeah, you can have the mic.
Thank you. I think the first question is to define polarization. Is it just economic or political or military? It's just one state or block of it. You just put all these countries together, but actually you can see the differences even within these blocks, and also interdependence, huge of them within and between these blocks. So it is a difficult question. And of course, there's risk, there's tensions between these major powers, which also cause huge damages globally, because you have to buy two systems, just not one system, and technology are totally separate. It costs two to buy one. So this is a problem. And of course, UAE, I say in this Hili forum, it could play, as my distinguished speakers talk today, that could be a bridge between the East and the West. And we can see that in this forum and also Ukraine crisis. And also it's very inclusive to bring all the scholars here. Let's imagine it. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a forum like this, probably in Asia, probably in Berlin, probably in Washington, D.C. But now it's very difficult. It's very difficult to bring East and West scholars and distinguished, senior members together, except except in these emerging places. So in one way, I think that they could bring these talents and also could borrow both sides of the technologies here, and also can create platform for these people to talk about it. I think this is incredible. This is incredible. And of course that the tensions here exist as the speaker talked today. But hopefully it is still possible to do these things, especially for these middle powers, not just middle in these size, but middle neutral powers to keep these connected.
Dr. Brendon, I see you nodding your head here. And I wanted to ask you, to navigate this complex landscape, do emerging powers need to choose an alliance, choose a partnership with either or? And what are the benefits and risks of aligning with one or the other, in your view?
That's a great question. And I appreciate my colleague's answer because I agree completely with what he said here in terms of laying the groundwork. One of the most exciting things we see is countries like the UAE, who are purportedly in the middle of this high polarity, great power rivalry, this rivalrous world that we're seeing develop. And I think there's a lot of opportunity spaces for states, especially with capabilities and human capital that the UAE has, but a number of states around the world. This could be in East Africa, these could be in Southeast Asia, these could be in South America, to take advantage in some respects, or let me put it this way: there's that opportunity space to engage with the best tech leaders out there right now. There's an appetite not only on the part of states like the UAE, there's an appetite on the part of the United States and China and South Korea and other major tech powers to engage as well. And so I think that it's really, really a fecund time in the development and the longevity of the prosperity of certain states like the UAE to take advantage of these. So there is a serious silver lining in the cloud if we want to look at that way.
Dr. Tianjiao, I saw you nodding your head as well. And I want to give you the same question. How can emerging powers navigate this complex landscape? And do they need to choose between this alliance or axis or that?
Yes. So I think everybody sitting here is very smart. So in fact, we all have our own answers, I think. It's very interesting. Yesterday, I also joined a session. I saw Igada sensei also sitting here with us today. So he reminded me that, in fact, if you ask Southeast Asian countries, they will emphasize that don't make us choose side. So I don't think that you have to pick either China or the United States. I think we just follow our own national interests, and it makes sense to me. And let me also add an example. When I think travel with Chinese high-tech companies, go abroad to visit their customers. They are high-tech companies. I think you know that China is good at like building bridges, infrastructures, tunnels everywhere along the Belt Road Initiative. But now, in fact, Chinese high-tech companies, they are quite competitive across the world. So not just the Huawei, not just the cell phone or servers. For example, cloud computing. In fact, they are very competitive, very efficient, reliable, and also quite cheap cloud computing service across the world, in fact. But when we talk with their customers abroad, I think most of the answer is that you provide quite good quality products or service, but it will be just part of our, so in fact, that they will still open to, companies, product services from Western countries. So because I think they have concerns about, geopolitical risks and also sanctions from some countries, maybe. So I think it's wise just to keep the balance and stay focused to your own interests. I think that's it. Yes.
Okay, I'll just give the mic to Dr. Yu here. speaking of polarization, I just wanted to stay on it for one last question. When we talk about these two axes, as people who, even people who roughly know about, geopolitical tensions and alliances, you sort of group these countries together for a lot of different reasons. But in your experience, do socio-cultural elements sort of play a big role in creating these alliances, if we can call them, or axes? And is it natural, because there are common socio-cultural elements between these countries, for them to partner in other sectors, and very important sectors like technology?
It's a difficult question. Samuel Huntington went through the book called The Clash of Civilizations. And the more I think about today's world, the world is divided not only along political divisions, but also by cultures. I do think cultures matter. And also, for example, there are cultural affinity between, say, Asian Americans or Chinese Americans in US and Chinese in China in their, say, how they view family, education, science, and technology. So there are cultural differences beyond political divide. But I do think most countries, smaller countries, will choose one of the other or both, or combination of them, because developing technology, AI, for example, requires large investments, requires large amounts of data. And data in the same text data do not exist in most languages. Actually, the two languages with the largest number of users, especially in producing text data, is either English or Chinese. And if you want to have AI to cover many topics, you need text input, because all AI today is basically fueled by data. And you need data in order to have output. And where to get the data? Only the two languages that provide adequate data for training, either English and Chinese. Say, if you want to know some subject history, some place, and the text will be either from English and Chinese. And of course, text written in either English or Chinese is culturally biased, sometimes for political reasons, for cultural reasons. And you don't get language input in minor language. Arabic is actually a larger language. Just imagine most languages are spoken by very small populations. So they are going to rely on AI systems that are trained initially either English or Chinese. So in the future, what programs you use in AI will affect your culture. So minor cultures will be affected by either American system or Chinese system.
And just a fun fact that I'd like to say, did you know that Arabic consists 1% of the whole internet? So it's a very minor number, but we do have a successful model here in the UAE, which is the JACE language model. And it's very impressive that it's become a successful platform, even with Arabic being the data, 1% of the whole internet. Speaking of AI, I wanted to move on to a very important topic in our discussion here, which is semiconductors and microchips. In the heart of these geopolitical tensions are these nanometer wide and high chips that are arguably setting the tone and deciding where billions of dollars are going, regional and global tensions, trade wars and high tariffs, and very possibly the results of the presidential elections of one of the most powerful countries in the world. All because of a chip that has become the center of our lives, ladies and gentlemen. And I think we can all agree, these chips run our mobile phones, our washing machines, our cars. And on the other hand, they also run fighter jets, missiles, drones, and are a big part of modern day warfare. So I think we can say that because of this, if I may, and we can disagree, the US has enacted a series of decisions that are meant to block Chinese access to high-power US semiconductors / microchips. More recently, the Biden administration, not very recently, imposed the CHIPS Act to make it harder for Beijing to reach and produce advanced chips. The act approved a whopping $280 billion package to support the innovation in the US in this field. Now, this sort of tension and competition on arguably one of the most important technological advancements of our time has really, really impacted supply chains around the world. And in fact, this effect has directly also affected emerging tech powers around the world who are trying to build their own technological landscape, and microchips are a very big part of that. So, Dr. Tianjiao, I wanted to get back to you. How are global supply chains being disrupted specifically by this US-Chinese rivalry in the field of microchips? And how can emerging powers sort of adapt to these changes? And yeah, we're going to give you the mic. Adapt to these changes and get their hands on what they need to develop with this really disrupted supply chain?
This is a very challenging question. To be frank, I think China suffered a lot, really suffered a lot from US sanctions, export control. You know, I think nobody expected trade war, tech war by Donald Trump in 2018. You know, it's a great shock to Chinese economy and also to the global supply chain, I think. You know, before Donald Trump, I mean, when during the Obama administration, in fact, I remember that I think there were over like 100 official dialogues between China and United States, and there are like first and second world economy, very closely, I mean, interdependent economic relations, financial relations. And I think there were over like 360 flights connecting both countries across the Pacific. So can you imagine that? The United States suddenly decided to carry out the so-called decoupling strategy against China. So, I mean, China really suffered a lot from that. So all of the supply chain, yes, I think it was disrupted. And we investigated with all of the foreign countries' Chamber of Commerce in China. So we asked the same questions, and they almost provided the same answers. Due to the uncertainties and challenges brought by the China-US trade war and tech war, they have to advise their companies, their members, to do some, you know, to diversify their supply chain, to withdraw some of the investment, to redeploy some of the factories to neighboring countries of China. So this is a sad story, and it has been a great shock to Chinese economy in recent years. I have to say, to be frank. But I think it also brought some opportunities. In fact, you know, I think China is also an emerging tech power. It's not an established power now. It's also emerging tech power.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So China is trying to, as I mentioned earlier, to have its own independent, self-reliant technology development. So thanks to the US sanction now, China is building its own, you know, manufacturing power of the chips, semiconductor. Mm-hmm. So we can do 28 nanometers now. I hope maybe in several years it will be like 14 nanometers. I'm not sure about 7. It's quite challenging, but 14 is good. Mm. And I'm quite optimistic. Mm-hmm. But I think in the maybe 5 to 10 years that we will have our own chip ecosystem.
Yeah. Dr. Brendon, Dr. Tianjiao is saying it's a very sad fact, and the effects of these sanctions have been very strong on the Chinese tech innovation space and their economy. But I'm sure there are reasons. There are reasons for every decision. And going back to the security issue, if you can explain to us, what are the risks of mishandling these microchips? As I'm sure this is at the core of these sanctions. So just so the audience can know, what are the security risks of having such a powerful technological invention, or the microchip?
Well, I am no superconductor chip expert, so you did a very good job introducing the topic. These power absolutely everything. And so maintaining an edge in terms of production, in terms of technological advancement is pretty important to, I would say, any country where that's within reach. I'm not aware of any historical case where a state that has achieved a position of technological superiority or dominance in many things voluntarily dismantles that in some kind of quid pro quo measures. And so I think this goes to the heart of U.S. concerns about whether the tech world, where is it going, and how is that tech going to be used. The security background again, and I'm a security studies scholar, so like a hammer sees everything as a nail, I see everything as a security problem, so forgive me. But there, again, the U.S. did not have major problems with the rise of China, right? Yes, it's just a democracy and things like that. But at the end of the day, it was actually very, very helpful. 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, et cetera, et cetera. It's a changing China itself and a changing United States. We all evolve as states. And that conundrum of Taiwan in particular, the home to major superconductor chip manufacturing, that is really at the crux of the issue here. And here we get to the limits of hedging, right? Nobody talks about Taiwan hedging. It's a small state in the international system. Why not? Well, again, perhaps for many in our audience, it's self-evident. But the point is here that there is a very real security concern, not just on the part of the United States, but on the part of China's neighbors. And so I'll end there. But
yeah, I'm glad you brought up Taiwan. We're going to get to that next. But staying on the point of supply chain, Dr. Tingyi, again, you stated that there are successful cases in the Gulf, particularly when it comes to accessing this technology, even with this fully, disrupted supply chain around the world, and using it for the country's prosperity, just as the UAE did. Can you give us some examples of that? How did it navigate this competition between the world's two superpowers in the tech space?
First, I'd like to say something about chips. I say not just about technology innovation, but also matters to market and in manufacturing. If you look at these, China has 1.4 billion population, and the manufacturing ability is massive. It's increasing. Even Taiwan is part
They
of.
cannot hear. I apologize. Maybe you can use my microphone.
Sorry, I mean that not just about the technology, but also about market and manufacturing ability. China has 1.4 billion population, and it purchases more value of chips than oil per year. You can imagine that you cannot ignore this market. This market will create lots of companies, either Chinese company or international company. Even Taiwan is part of China. It's in East Asia, not in West, So you see that these countries here, they are very, very important for these things. As for UAE, you will see that in one way, G42 and also AI University here for the company, education, and also AI forum in Riyadh recently. For all these things. Not just this. In one way, they cooperated with Microsoft. We saw it today. But at the same time, they also maintain cooperation with Huawei. This is a really smart move because they actually bring all these things together here. I'm sure that if this conflict continue, lots of companies will try to find a safe hub in this region instead of in the East and West.
Thank you, Dr. Tingyi. That's a very powerful opinion and very true in a lot of cases. People will go to the safe hub at the end of the day. There's a lot of mention of Taiwan, and so we're going to get into that. But after this part of the conversation, I would like everyone who has a question to please scan the barcode. I will automatically be getting your questions here, and then you will have a chance to ask the panelists any questions that you have had so far. I will be posing your questions after this part of the discussion, which is Taiwan. Dr. Tingyi, you have said Taiwan is part of China. I think that's a bit contested. Let's leave it at that. I will call it a tiny island that, sorry? You see why I'm saying it's contested. I will not give an opinion as a professional journalist. I will call it a tiny island, which is caught in the crossfire of this deep tech war. This small island is the home of the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. And this is the world's largest semiconductor chip manufacturer, which is estimated to produce 90% of the world's advanced chips. It's a very powerful feat that Taiwan is under. The very fate of the semiconductor industry could rest on this tiny island. And as with any emerging very powerful country like Taiwan, the US and China, it is a point of contention between the two powers. Recently, the US has banned companies that use US technologies in their chips, like TSMC, from doing business with Huawei. And this is part of sanctions and decisions that the US has made. So TSMC can no longer do business with Chinese companies. It's a very big topic and it's a very big part of our conversation. And Dr. Yu, I wanted to get back to you on this because I believe we first have to explore the deeply rooted cultural and social issues that are intertwined in this case study that has been the main point of contention, or one of the main points of contention for these two countries for decades. What are these issues and have they contributed to Taiwan being in the middle of this tech war between the US and China?
Let me give you my bottom line, then I will elaborate. My bottom line is the export restrictions of high-level chips to China, I think, can only slow down technological development in China, but will not stop China's development in high tech. So that's my bottom line. And if you look at now, let's look at chips. Chips were invented by the US, actually in New Jersey, silicon. But on the other hand, the best makers of computer chips have been located in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And I think there's a reason for that. I think for different reasons, I cannot get into. Chinese population is highly motivated to do well in school, to excel academically, especially in science and technology. China today produces far more engineers, scientists than US. In fact, about half of scientists and engineers in the US are foreign born. They are immigrants. They complete their bachelor's degrees abroad and then go to US, half of them. And the largest supplier of foreign students to the US are Chinese. 40% of those are from China. And they just, the whole society is organized in such a way that young people of different family backgrounds work very hard, compete for admission at Tsinghua and Beida, and especially in science and engineering. So the incentive is for social mobility is very strong. And I think that's not only true in China, that's also true in Taiwan, in Korea, in Japan, and even in America, Asia America. They had a successful lawsuit against Harvard because Chinese Americans want to be admitted to Harvard elite schools and Princeton. So the educational motivation is very strong in Chinese culture. That propels a very large, smartest group of youth to excel in science and engineering. And the human capital, I think, is a big explanation for China's success in science and technology. If you look at science and technology, two features stand out. One is universality. What is true, can be done in one country, can be replicated elsewhere. Knowledge is universal. Newton's law is Newton's law, whether it's in China or US, past and today. It's the same law. And same for algorithms, AI, same for physics behind chip making. So once it's demonstrated, can be done, it can be replicated elsewhere. And Chinese, for some reason, are very good producers and users of existing technology because knowledge is open. It's in public domain. So knowledge can be learned and be put to use in China much better than others. So I think over time, China is going to overcome the difficulties imposed by export restrictions, and especially when computing may move to away from chips, say quantum computing. China is a leader in quantum computing. So I think that the restriction can only slow down, will not stop China.
Thank you, Dr. Yu, for that insight. Dr. Brendon, again, the security risks. What is the security risk of Taiwan and its greatly developed technology market being completely controlled by, let's say, China?
Well, you should ask the Taiwanese, but that's
But here, but you're the security expert.
So yeah, look, I mean, this, as I said earlier, this kind of goes to the crux of the problem. Is Taiwan Chinese or not? And there's a lot of disagreement on this, and I think rightly so. This is actually an existential security concern for an island state, but there's the geopolitical side of this as well. Taiwan represents, in some respects, a cork in the bottle kind of thing. That cork, that island, hems China in to some degree, and understandably, China's not very happy about this. I don't know any state in that position that would be, especially a very powerful state like China, and therefore it has great interests in not just prosecuting what it terms a one China policy, but there's a geopolitical element to this. The corollary of that, or the flip side of this, is that lots of states around there, to include Japan and Korea and the Philippines and the United States, see it opposite, and they would prefer the cork to remain in the bottle. Okay. Now, again, if this was just a technology and economic supremacy issue, then that would be a technological and economic supremacy issue. But it's more than that, isn't it? It's actually highly political. It's actually highly militaristic. It's actually highly security renowned. And so this has led to this really dangerous situation where states are not really talking to one another, as my esteemed colleague from Fudan University said. But this is again part. We talked about the U.S. side having its problems. The Chinese side also has its problems. We're supposed to have a summit, then some balloons were flown over Canada and the United States, and the summit was canceled. The Pentagon has been attempting for years to set up a hotline with the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. That has been refused on Beijing's side. So again, it's a messy issue, and we should talk about it in a nuanced manner.
And Dr. Tianjiao, this is a very important question to wrap up sort of the Taiwan case study. Is the Taiwan case study indicative of how great power competition between countries like the US and China will play out for the foreseeable future for, let's say, emerging tech powers? Is this what the future will look like?
Yes, thank you, Lina. I think Taiwan and TSMC is an extreme example. I assure you that it will not happen to any companies here in UAE. I think just like Brandon mentioned that because US has a lot of security concerns about Taiwan issue. And I just want to add that maybe US has also concerns about if the mainland China unified Taiwan sometime later, it would lose TSMC. So which is a very, very important part to US global semiconductor supply chain. US cannot afford such kind of big loss to both, international security, credibility of its alliance system, and also economic and technology loss. So I think this is the key issue here. But again, maybe I'm very optimistic. I think maybe in 5 to 10 years, China can have its own, semiconductor manufacturing capability. I think if everything goes smoothly in 5 to 10 years. And maybe in that case, when China surpass US in economic growth, then Taiwan will no longer be a problem.
Thank you very much. I'm just looking at our questions here. I apologize, ladies and gentlemen, if it took me some time. The conversation is very interesting. We have 91 questions that have came in from our esteemed audience. So I think this is indicative of how well the conversation has been going. It's a bit hard to choose one. So let me just choose. I think we could choose about 3, maybe. We have about 20 minutes. I had a final. We were going to close it off with recommendations, but I think we should just take everyone's questions. Sorry, I have to 91 questions. All right. I think this is a good one. Speaking of emerging tech powers, it's different when you identify emerging tech powers and developing countries, right? There's a bit of a difference there. And I think we need to speak about developing countries because, it's a lot of countries. So this question, it says, how can developing countries compete with advanced economies under the current status of protectionism and industrial policy? I think this is a very good question to hit on in this conversation. Dr. Tingyi, would you like to give your opinion?
I totally agree with that. And the global south, if we see developing countries, they are actually majority in this world. And they also suffer a lot with this global crisis and also great power competition. It's very important for these global south countries to say no sometime together. Say to these giants that we don't want this thing. We want a more sustainable, stable global order. I think that's very, very important. To be honest, sometimes one state or two states, small state, cannot compete with this global power or emerging power. But together, it will be very, very different.
Thank you, Dr. Tingyi. I'm just going to take one answer for each question so we can get through as many as we can. This is a very interesting one. We all know that there's an eye on Africa. Africa is the home of so much resources, which is equivalent to billions of dollars, as we all know, with the right investment. So this question is about raw materials, and I think the person who asked it has Africa in mind, if I'm not mistaken. And they're saying, do you think that the current trend of raw materials competition shall continue, or a more circular mode of manufacturing, which can shift the demand away from the current mineral hotspots? So I believe they are speaking about Africa, and we have to say that these minerals are essential to building and advancing technologies that we are using in this day and age. Anyone would like to address this question?
So, lots of countries have developed mercantilistic policies vis-a-vis rare earth metals and minerals. And Africa, as Congo in particular, is really the hot spot of this. In many respects, states in the international system mimic one another. This is that culture that we see in the international system. So Japan, for example, has been doing this since the 1970s in Africa. And I think as manufacturing sectors develop in places like China, of course, Southeast Asia, India now, and other states, Brazil in particular, they're increasingly adopting these policies, these mercantilistic policies. There's an element of that geopolitical competition involved in this because they are so necessary for manufacture. Do I see this ending anytime soon? Beyond the development of actual export of products rather than raw materials in places like Congo, I don't see it changing much. One of the interesting things here is that China actually is a rare earth metal producer, a massive one, and so this is part of that. The so-called scramble for these elsewhere in the world is part and partial because of it's difficult for many states to get those out of China now because of export controls.
Thank you, Dr. Brendon. This is a very interesting question as well, and it really has to do with our theme. And I think, Dr. Tianjiao, I'm going to address it to you. This person is asking, how might emerging tech powers strategically invest in key technologies? So I think we would like to know what key technologies should emerging tech powers be investing in to compete with massive state-backed initiatives in China and the private sector driven innovation of the US?
Well, this is a very good question. I think first you have to identify the key technology or technology. But what are these technologies, right? So you need to have. I would like to remind Dr. Yu Xie just mentioned. I think human capital is also very important. So you need to have quite powerful, young scientists, technologists, because they are the frontiers of technology development, and I think they are very smart, very sensitive. They can help you identify the key technology, help you do the smart decision to make the decision about investment. And second point I would like to mention is that we need long-term policy. Because in fact, high tech or the so-called what key technology or emerging technology, this in fact is full of risks. I think just we heard from the plenary session. In fact, there are a lot of risks brought by developing high tech or emerging technologies. A lot of failures, big costs. So you need to have the long-term policy, and also the long-term investment. I think long-term capital. And maybe I would like to add final sentence that we also need a very professional bureaucratic team. I think this is the successful model from, well, if you think China is good at this, I think from China, also from Japan maybe in the past decades. We all have for example, Japan has the Ministry of Industrial and Trade, and also China has the Committee for Development and Reform. I think they are the team identify these key sectors and help guide the long-term investment. Yes.
This one is we touched on it briefly, but I think if we could give just quick points, maybe Dr. Yu, you would like to take up this question. It said, how can we promote transparency and trust building measures, and what specific steps can be taken to foster greater international collaboration? I believe here for our purposes in the tech space, but also between countries in this heated competition like US and China in general.
Let me make a remark about the earlier question. I disagree a little bit. I think with Dr. Jiang, I think state policies could be beneficial to science and technology, especially in human capital investment, infrastructure, in general directions. But however, sometimes too heavy-handed control of scientists and projects and the top-down model may against innovation. I think American system is great because it allows academics, young people to have innovative, creative ideas that may contradict state policy, may contradict authority, and so on. I think the flat, free system of US has a huge advantage over China in creating new technology, in creating new ideas. But anyway, it's a controversial topic. I would like to go back to your question. I think in today's world, we're likely to see increasing gaps in technology between superpowers, technological superpowers, and the rest of the world. I think that's going to emerge a new divergence, not based on level of development, because China is still middle income, but as a scale, China is huge. And in terms of technology capacity, China is huge. It's probably equal in many areas, actually surpasses the US. So you have a new world order in technology. You have dominant ones, China and US, and rest of the world, the standard usually set by one of the other in 5G, in AI, in all areas of technology. So I think other countries should be afraid, should be concerned about dominance of these two countries, because they carry their own agenda, be political, cultural, economic, and China is explicit in preserving state interest in political interest in South China Sea, in other areas, and neighbors are very concerned. And someone yesterday said China has no friend, international friend. So the concerns are real, because dominance means you have access to other countries' data, for example. You set standard, and you have to rely on those countries and companies for the long term. So I think I agree with Dr. Wang. I think other countries should be united in making demands for transparency, in having a voice. Someone also said yesterday, if you're not, you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. I think the same as technology. I think even though other countries don't develop technologies because the demand of scale, demand of investment, they should have a voice in helping set the standard, demanding for transparency. I think if other countries are united, they can make more out of technology from the two dominant powers.
Thank you, Dr. Yu, for your insights. We now have about 100 questions, and I cannot ignore the fact that almost half of them are asking about the Israel-Palestine conflict. A lot of questions are taking us in a different direction. I can talk about that, but we will stay until, another weeks if we want to. But there is one question that is more relevant to our topic here. And, in the spirit of giving the audience what they want and answering questions and topics that they really want to discuss here. I think it's more about how regional conflict affects landscapes like the tech landscape, and affects how developing countries look towards advancement and growth in their countries, their economies, and so forth. So in light of this topic, this question is a bit relevant, I believe. This person is asking that advances in biotechnologies and synthetic biology could lower the threshold for extremist and terrorist groups to cause catastrophic risks using these technologies. So they're asking what frameworks should guide the development and regulation of such technologies. And I think regulation is something that we haven't touched upon, and I think it's an important part of our conversation. So I think it's a good question, and I would love your thoughts on it.
The good news is that I think scientists everywhere have their own ethics. So I hope that we could appeal to scientists, because you need scientists to make those dangerous weapons. I think sometimes I know a lot of biological scientists in China, for example. They're certainly against unethical use of science for biological weapons, and even for, say, genetic engineering. I think it's clear when the first genetic engineering was practiced by a doctor in China, the whole scientific community, government didn't know. They actually sent a congratulations. This is a huge success. It could be Nobel Prize winning scientific discovery. It's actually banned by scientists everywhere. So there is a huge backlash against unethical use of science. I think scientific community is one community we could count on, because scientists do communicate with each other. They share basic ethics.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. Anyone else want to add to the regulation part of the conversation? Dr. Tingyi?
Yes, we talk about AI and also high technology these years. As I see that this is more risky and dangerous than nuclear weapons, because you will not use nuclear weapons, but you use AI, you use all these things every day and reach to everyone. If these things are weaponized by some group of people, it is very dangerous. And recently we see that not only United States, but the EU and in China, these major powers, they are trying to set up regulations for this new technology, especially AI. But we haven't seen or common regulations in the world for all these things. And this will cause competition, that some country will use some of the technology as a weapon to do something. This is very, very dangerous. Even during the Cold War, there's agreement between Soviet Union and United States about nuclear weapon. But nowadays, we haven't seen these things. This is a pity, as I see. So probably UAE and also this emerging middle power, as I said, could probably play a role to set up platform or some dialogue between these major powers to do something like this. I think this will be very, very promising and helpful for the future stability.
Dr. Tingyi, I think that's a great end to our session. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. An hour and 15 minutes has passed pretty quickly. Thank you to our experts for their really valuable insights. And thank you for making this conversation a debate, but also a very good and insightful information as well. Thank you all for joining and enjoy the rest of the forum. Thank you.